Okay, good afternoon, everyone. Hello, and welcome to our panel on education technologies and AI in the classroom. And I am absolutely delighted to be here representing the Five Rights Foundation. Our mission is to build the digital world that children and young people deserve. And we have an absolutely fabulous panel here for you today to talk indeed about what children deserve and what they're actually getting in school when it comes to digital technologies. I am going to introduce our speakers maybe as they speak, because I think you probably recognize all these names, I would think. And in the program, they have nice little biographies also, but I'm going to give a bit more detail so that you have a bit more context as they introduce their work and their findings. But first of all, just a few points about why on earth we are here. When it comes to digital technologies, education is very often mentioned as one of the obvious areas where there is huge amounts of opportunities. There are absolutely magnificent promises in terms of digital and AI in particular for revolutionizing the world of learning and all of the problems that teachers face in unequal access to education, et cetera, all of this is going to be solved by digital technologies, and AI in particular also indeed is the promise. But what is the reality, and how can we make sure that children's rights, including their right to education, but also their variety of other rights, including in particular their right to privacy and to development, how can we ensure that as these technologies are rolled out, those rights are balanced and fulfilled? I think the context today is indeed that with the pandemic, there was a very rapid rolling out of education technology in the classroom. And since then, we have seen, to some extent, a backlash. So if we look at the Nordic countries, for example, there's been a lot of desire now to completely pull back. At the same time, we have other countries like Estonia and Greece who are introducing OpenAI into the classroom. And we have all sorts of new companies promising personalized learning. Some of you might have heard of things like the Alpha School system in the US, which is 2 hours a day of personal AI tutors, and then the rest of the time you can play sports or invest in other things. So again, all sorts of promises, all sorts of new developments, and everyone kind of going in different directions, say pulling back, going all in. There's a lot happening. So in this context, let's see what our experts have to say about the direction that we're going in and where we should go from here. I'm going to start by asking Mark West from UNESCO to give us an idea with a bit of a kind of longitudinal approach, because Mark did this absolutely amazing piece of work and published this book called The EdTech Tragedy, which was looking at the impact of EdTech during the pandemic. And as the title suggests, Mark, an EdTech tragedy doesn't sound that things were going too well. And you've done a lot of research leading to that book, but then a lot more since as well. So I think I'm really interested in hearing from you. What were the conclusions? What did you draw in your work for UNESCO on the EdTech Tragedy book? What are the main outcomes of that? And then also maybe afterwards you can tell us a little bit about if things have changed. It might have been a tragedy then, but is it now, I don't know, a massive success?
Well, thanks a lot for inviting me, and thanks a lot for the cooperation with Five Rights. UNESCO really values the opportunities to work with organizations like Five Rights that are looking at children's rights in digital environments, and something we're very concerned with at UNESCO as well. Yes, we did a major analysis of what happened during COVID-19 and this moment when sort of all of formal education became reliant on screens. So education basically moved from schools to screens. And our question was very simple. What happened? What occurred? And what I love about this analysis is it sort of rips questions of the future of education, questions about technology and AI of education out of the will, would, might, should, tomorrow, it'll happen, and looks at what actually occurred, what really happened in real places to real people. And the book is called An EdTech Tragedy for a reason. It really documents the way education was diminished and educational outcomes suffered even when the technology worked exactly as intended. It does this over 600 very well documented sort of pages. So for those of you who want to sort of understand what happened during that period and what the results were, I'd encourage you to sort of look to that book. But I think what the book really does is it problematizes this idea of what we call technology solutionism, this idea that there's a problem and there's a sort of simple and clean technological fix to that problem. Education, of course, is the questions are far more layered and complex. And so this idea of sort of positioning a technology to be able to solve these problems is in itself a sort of problem and a kind of mythology that we keep telling ourselves and renewing again and again. The book includes a quote from Thomas Edison in 1913 saying that education will be completely remade, schools and teachers will become redundant because of the technology that Thomas Edison had invented in 1913, which was the motion picture machine. So this idea that a technology is just around the corner and will completely sort of change education has been with us for over a century. We're hearing it all over again with artificial intelligence, that this technology really is different. Everything is poised to sort of change. I'm pretty skeptical for a lot of these reasons. We were talking about, pulling conversations about EdTech out of the hypothetical, the would, the could, the might, the should, tomorrow, and looking at what's happening. And maybe there are very good reasons to be excited about AI's applicability in education, but my question is, where are the results? ChatGPT was rolled out in late 2022. It's almost 4 years that these technologies have been with us. We're here in Europe. These technologies are on everybody's phones, have been for over a year. What we're actually seeing, if you want to look at sort of results on standardized test scores, results on reading and math, is actually declining performance. Why is that the case? If these technologies are really going to sort of lead to massive improvements in education, we should be starting to see some of those results. The book also sort of talks about how when you apply technology to a problem, the sort of problem you're trying to solve often gets twisted in very unusual ways. COVID provided a very good example of that. The original reason to use technology in education was because schools were closed. It was a health emergency, and that provided some connection to formal education during the pandemic. Schools in Europe and other places reopened fairly quickly. In some parts of the world, the school closures lasted over 2 full academic years. So it depended where you were in the world. But here in Belgium and France and other countries, the school closures were relatively short compared to other parts of the world. But then the conversation changed. When the schools reopened, then technology was being applied. Why? Technology was being applied to correct learning loss. So schools were closed, students had not learned as much, and now the purpose of technology was sort of to leapfrog, to catch up, to accelerate learning so that that learning would be caught up. So the solution was the same during school closures to correct learning loss. The answer was always technology. We're seeing that again with AI. I just was looking on the train right here, I was looking at framing for an event that we'll be at, and it was saying that sort of the purpose of education now is to train students to use AI so they can be competitive in the job market. So now the purpose of education is to teach people how to use technology. So the thing that's not going away is this idea of that technology is sort of central to these whole processes. So I think the book is a warning to be careful about how when you frame a problem and say technology is the answer to your question, the question often gets sort of deformed or changed in some sort of way. The thing you were setting out to solve, it can twist in unusual ways.
So, Mark, if I can come back on a few things. I mean, first to say your book is about the pandemic, and indeed shows that there's that the technology didn't really deliver much for learning outcomes during the pandemic. But now you're saying that actually afterwards, what you've seen since is that it's been used to kind of correct this learning loss from the pandemic, and it's still just creating even more problems. They haven't managed to address this gap at all using technology. So this sounds a bit like a vicious circle that we're just getting worse and worse.
It is and can be a vicious circle. And at UNESCO, the question we sort of, technology is often positioned as sort of, it's a solution. Maybe it is a solution, but it depends on what you're trying to accomplish. And at UNESCO, we pay really close attention to what the purpose of education is. And people have ascribed, throughout history, my background actually is in history, people have ascribed all sorts of purposes to education. Education has historically been about learning religious doctrine and, teaching sort of correct moral and ethical behavior. Education, if you go back to, ancient Greece and Sparta, education was about preparing people for war. And the way that education was structured was to build good soldiers who would follow instructions and be very tough in battle. I mean, John Dewey talks about the purpose of education is to prepare people for democratic participation. So how applicable or non-applicable technology is depends on what it is you're trying to do with education. UNESCO, the organization I work for, was founded in 1945 out of the rubble of World War II. UNESCO was founded on a premise that peace could be built through education, and that through cooperation in education, science, and culture, we could build cultures of peace and try to avoid this horrific violence that had, really been centered in Europe in World War I and World War II. So that's a sort of specific purpose. Now, if your purpose is to build cultures of peace, what exactly is the role of AI? That's an interesting sort of question. If you're trying to build people who are going to participate in a democratic society and contribute to their communities in certain ways, then what are the roles of AI in that, if those are your objectives? We tend to blindly assume that the objectives of education and purposes of education are cemented and set. They're not. They're being negotiated. And sometimes when people tell you that the purpose of education is purely about building economically competitive societies, trying to get more skills than your neighbors so that you can be successful and make money in a competitive job market, those may be some purposes of education. But at UNESCO, we really tried to hammer home that education is about individuals, but it also and necessarily must be about us together, us as a society. And I think sometimes the collective and holistic and community purposes of education get lost. And they really get lost in the ways that technology is implemented in education. Even the term personalized learning implies learning that is aimed only at an individual rather than at a group. Everybody, if you go to an education conference, or maybe not an education conference, but out in the street and you say, are you for personalized learning? Everybody will say, that's fantastic. Personalized learning sounds great. Mm-hmm. But education is also about cohorts, generational cohorts. It's also about having people encounter adults who are outside of their family. We talked about the purposes of education. Education has all sorts of implicit purposes, learning to read, do math better, build some historical understandings. But it also has so many latent purposes, which are arguably more important. Latent purposes are learning about nutrition, learning about your body, meeting adults who are outside of your family, getting to know peers, socialization, acculturation, learning a little bit of nationalism is often a sort of latent purpose of education. That we don't sort of test students on these things, but we trust that the education system delivers these things. Okay. And if that's what you want, then where's the place and role of technology? That's a different question.
Thank you very much. I think we can see and feel your passion, and it's true that it's also difficult to see how that kind of passion is going to be reflected by a digital technology company. I mean, you said at the beginning, you said educational outcomes diminished even when tech worked exactly as intended. So I think this is one of the big points that I think the panel will be discussing. Indeed, what is the purpose and who is intending what? And as I say, listening to you, I hardly think that Google Classroom or Microsoft or even Duolingo or whatever quite share exactly the same vision of education as you put forward there. And as you said as well, learning is complex. How we learn is complex. And I think maybe one of the things that we'll be exploring is how that complexity is slightly getting lost. So yeah, misalignment of purpose, I think we're going to take forward. I'm going to come now to you, Sonia. So Professor Sonia Livingston from the LSE, and most importantly, your most important role out of many, many roles that you have, is as Director of the Digital Futures for Children Centre, a joint research centre between Five Rights and the LSE. And at the Digital Futures for Children Centre, for quite a few years now, you've been looking at education technology, first from a data protection perspective in particular, and then more recently, as part of the Better EdTech project. And you've spent a lot of time talking with kids and with teachers and looking at what's actually going on in the classroom and how these technologies are impacting children's learning. So I think you can tell us a little bit about what purpose they're serving and what they're delivering.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Leander. And thank you for including me in the panel, and great to follow Mark, whose work I very much admire, and whose book set off a kind of provocation, I think, for very many of us about what is going on. So Mark's book dropped on my desk when we were in the middle of a previous body of work that was really trying to understand what was happening with data protection and children's privacy in relation to the kind of gradual influx of technology into the classroom and indeed into children's homes for the purposes of learning, among other things. And the more we began kind of exploring, and that's a kind of previous body of work really, about the impossibility of understanding, especially from a school perspective, what data is really being collected from children during the school day, where it goes, how it is regulated, or how effectively it is regulated. We had a lot of depressing answers. And we raised a lot of questions about privacy, about the commercial exploitation of children's learning, and about the adequacy of data protection regulators. But that really did take us into questions about education, and that's what's kind of so fascinating. So isn't it weird that children's data is now one of the ways in which EdTech, and especially AI, is profitable? And therefore it is offered to schools for free, and therefore it is under the aegis of the data protection officers to decide data protection, yes, but education, perhaps not. And so we started kind of trying to understand what's the relation between the data protection regulator and the ministries of education. And we did this in Britain, though we are keeping a very close eye on European debates and increasingly working internationally also on these kinds of projects. So in the last, so at the DFC and with Five Rights, we work within a child rights framework. And isn't it interesting that in the Convention on the Rights of the Child, there are several rights that are very relevant to education. Article 28 says children have the right to go to school, or the right to an education, but it doesn't really say what. What would happen when they get there and what that vision is. And then Article 29 says children have the right to be supported so they can develop to their fullest. And I think the vision there is very close to the one that Mark just articulated. But that vision, sad to say, is very different from the vision that is enacted in many of our schools. many of whom, and historians of education have often said, the purpose of school is to prepare people for work. And since work is stratified and we don't need a lot of professors, we're not going to, we're going to sort the kids and fit them to where they need to go, and that will be job done. And so education is, in many ways, its purposes, its avowed purposes, what it's funded for, has often been quite a long way from the vision. Leander, or maybe Julia, said, did I want to have a PowerPoint for this presentation? And I brought you a piece of paper instead, which has got pictures from our workshops with kids, which I'm going to give you a couple of minutes about, and QR codes, which is quite digital really, on the back to all our research. But the reason I wanted to show you, you can't see what fun the kids had with the workshops that we designed for them, but I can tell you one reason I didn't do a PowerPoint is that PowerPoint is one of the things that AI is super good at, and that both teachers and children in the workshops we did all over British schools had a lot to say about. So I might just take PowerPoint as a kind of little case study. I vividly remember one teacher who looked scathingly at the teacher carrying all the exercise books across the car park to go home and spend the evening, marking the children's work, saying, I do all of my classes on PowerPoint now. I do all of my assessment through AI because the PowerPoint is linked to the assessment. And when the kids don't get something right, they get a little AI bot or a YouTube video that tells them how to get it right. And the whole thing is automated, and that teacher encapsulated a vision of an AI future in which he had his evenings off. And other teachers in the same classroom, over almost the same cup of tea, had a lot to say about how AI, and especially AI made PowerPoints, were not meeting their vision of learning, their vision of what they wanted to do in the classroom. And they were very concerned about some of the kind of PowerPoint through to assessment, through to kind of supporting especially the struggling kids who were kind of left at home, as they later told us, crying because the YouTube video didn't actually answer the question about why they'd got something wrong. But that is nothing compared with the debate going on among the kids. So children also have incredibly diverse views, and we interviewed lots of kids who say they love the AI in the classroom. And they're bringing the AI into the classroom, and thank goodness they have it at home, because the teachers can't always explain things very well, and ChatGPT is actually very good at explaining things. And some of them were learning how to scaffold their learning. I don't understand this homework, I don't understand why I got it wrong. They were learning, don't just tell me the answer. Explain to me so I can learn better. So, there were some really excited accounts from children who felt AI is the future. They are in that world, and they are going to grab it with both hands. And then there were lots who were ranging from frustrated or bored to distraught about the way in which AI is being used in their schools. And we visited such different schools, so it's really impossible to generalize, because I think all schools are in some kind of experimental moment of what they're bringing in. Children saying, teachers made that PowerPoint on AI. I hate all the pictures. They don't look like me. They don't look like real children. Children describing seeing teachers go to a PowerPoint slide and think, actually, I can't really understand that. AI made it and I'm not quite sure what's on it and I don't know what it means. Children are being given tasks that are kind of super high tech for their homework, but they get 25% of extra time because they have special educational needs, but there isn't a way of telling the homework app that the kids need extra time. So they're just left, you're out of time. Kids telling us that they were doing the homework, jiggling the mouse or wiggling, actually I'm wiggling my screen so it doesn't turn off. They were wiggling their screen because the timer was about to time them out, and the EdTech can't go to the loo till after they finish their homework because the timer will rather than, you know, a lot of stories about the way in which the tech is actually being designed in ways that may be occupying children when they're at school and at home, but are certainly not delivering on their rights. And so let me just come back full circle, because I could tell you what they said in these workshops forever. So I think we have a big question about what we think school is. If we think school is an efficient way in which learning is delivered, knowledge is delivered, then AI created PowerPoints with teachers who have chance to relax in the evening, which is a very good thing, and everyone assessed on a standardized metric that ranks them neatly, presumably on facts that can be ranked neatly, not on fluffy subjects or other kinds of knowledge that doesn't fall neatly into multiple choice testing. You know, if that's the vision, and I think in many countries and for many governments, that is the vision. And Mark's vision, which I share, sounds like an enormously privileged, you know, what a happy world where we can all collaborate and learn together and be our best selves. And we can't afford that in our education budget. And so AI is going to help. And at that point, then, you know, we have to, last point, as child rights, with our child rights hats on, make a best interest decision. What is the education we're providing? What are the costs to privacy? And in fact, also to safety, which is a whole different conversation. Is it acceptable? Have we done a Faustian deal, or is it acceptable that children's data and profitability is being taken from them in a context that used to be traditionally public, the school, in a context where they don't have any chance to opt out or give consent because they've got to be there and they've got to do what the class is doing. Is that where our kind of best interest decision falls, or do we think we could do better?
Thank you, Sonia. I mean, that's super interesting. I think just that the fact of indeed coming at it from a child rights perspective means that in the end you need to balance children's rights and you need to do a best interest assessment. And so many things come into play here. I mean, does it indeed immediately benefit learning? Does it make it more fun, which could be a good thing in and of itself? Does it benefit children more broadly in their home life? I don't know. There are probably parents in the room who are not, I put my own hand up, who are not a big fan of that school computer with, you know, YouTube in the bedroom suddenly, you know, so there are broader benefits when we talk about, you know, Mark's vision of education in a much broader sense. Does it, you know, make teachers' lives easier? Sometimes maybe yes. I think sometimes also no. But if it does give them more time, then, you know, does it give it more time for learning, et cetera, et cetera. And in the end, I guess the question is who benefits and who pays. You know, you're talking about one of the first things we said is children's data is what makes the education technology profitable. But indeed, you know, is education supposed to be profitable? I think is a really, you know, a really big question. And when we look at indeed the costs of education, I do think, you know, this really comes in with like Nordic countries pulling back. Well, you know, actually EdTech is a lot cheaper, you say, than pens and papers and books. And if you have to replace it with something else, then someone has to pay. So all things I think to come back to. Sonia. Sorry, I say Sonia. Simone, let's move on to you. I need more of Sonia. But we will come back. Okay, Simone's got a really long CV as well. But essentially, Simone is Professor of Law at Leiden Law School at the Center for Law and Digital Technologies, and has a very long career focusing on children's rights also and digital technologies. And my favorite parts of your, as I say, very long CV are the Dutch Code van Kinderrechten. There's a Dutch, do you like appreciate my Dutch? Yep. The Dutch Children's Rights Codes specifically for digital technologies, and the Model Children's Rights Impact Assessment, I think is really key. So Simone has done loads of work and research in this area, and also teaching, but also some really practical tools and contributions to the policy landscape, both in the Netherlands and at the European level. And here, I think, you know, working within the School of Law, I'd really like to ask you, and then you can, you know, go in whatever directions you want. But, you know, we're supposed to have quite a lot of legal safeguards in this area. I mean, education obviously is something that's been around a long time, and as Sonia said, there are very critical rights there. But also at the European level, I mean, obviously we've had GDPR for quite a long time. If data is the currency here, and then we have prohibitions on the commercialization of childhood, then why is this not working? We now have Digital Services Act, AI Act, which should be in place. So don't we have the legal safeguards? And if we do, then why are they not being implemented? And if they're not being implemented, is this going to be, the next social media ban debate? Is the answer like, okay, it's not working, people, so just pull it all out, no more tech in the classrooms? Is that where we're going?
Well, I don't know, but I cannot see in the future, and even predictive analytics cannot do that. So I surely cannot do that. Yeah, I think I would. I'm a bit reluctant now, also after the first two speakers. First, maybe more general comment. A bit reluctant also because getting to the legal framework also means that we sort of already made a decision that we're going to develop something and that it needs to be in the classroom. To be honest, I'm also a bit reluctant there because whatever is going to be in the classroom in terms of tech or even AI should have educational value. It should not be just anything. As we sometimes see now. So it should have educational value in a given situation for children at a given age. So that's also not going to be the same for every child. And I was also, when I was listening to both Mark and Sonia, thinking about a lot of research that we've done into play, where I think the situation is a bit similar in the sense that tech certainly has a role to play in children's playful activities online, but we see a lot of manipulation, we see commercial exploitation. So play certainly is not very age appropriate in a sense. And we might say, okay, then the legal framework either is not there, but I don't think that's the case, or it's just not delivering. And I think that is basically the answer. So that's my short answer. It's just that we have the legal framework, but it's not delivering. So let's go into that question and assume that we're going to have EdTech or AI in the classroom. And then, of course, you need to start from the legal framework, because those services have to comply with the legal framework, and the legal framework also provides some guidance on how to do it in a way that is age appropriate and that actually takes children's privacy seriously. If we enforce those rules. So first, maybe start with the DSA because that's it's an easy one. Most of these EdTech services are not online platforms, so it doesn't apply. Then again, you might argue that YouTube, you just mentioned it, does have some educational value. I think for a lot of children, it's actually important also in terms of education, learning about math, that the teacher indeed cannot explain maybe very well in the classroom. So we see a lot about that and they get a lot of information there. But it's not a platform that's being specifically designed for children. So there's a lot of issues there. And what the DSA could do if it were to apply more generally to digital services is actually provide that idea of age-appropriate design also to EdTech. I think that might actually be important. And maybe it's not under the DSA, but it's certainly a concept that is being developed there that we should also apply to anything that is going to be used. If it's going to be used, that's going to be used in the classroom. Then maybe the AI Act. So it does say something about education. There's one unacceptable practice with something we haven't talked about yet, emotion recognition in education. So, but I'll leave it there. So that's an unacceptable practice that's even prohibited, which also goes to the precautionary principle. Maybe quickly to mention here that anything that might be harmful to children, even if we're not sure yet, we should have those guardrails. So just to put that here as well. And then some educational systems might be high risk. We don't know exactly what will be high risk. So will it be any EdTech or, specifically EdTech that is actually providing risks to the safety and maybe the health of children, because it's a safety law. So we don't actually know what will be covered exactly by that, but it might put up some guardrails. Then again, it's postponed until the end of 2027 because we don't have enough guidance. So we have to wait for that. And then I think the most important one is the GDPR, and the most maybe also disappointing one in the sense of not having had any effect so far, because I think it's the most promising one. A lot of things that you mentioned the social media ban. I don't think we would have had these discussions about banning social media if the GDPR were enforced against those platforms that we're mostly talking about when we're discussing social media bans. And I think the same thing would need to apply when we're starting to use EdTech in classrooms or even AI systems in classrooms, because I think it would actually, it could actually mostly address the issues that Sonja was mentioning. And just to give you some examples, obviously, we have the digital omnibus, so maybe to start with that, when we're talking about AI, so training AI is going to be a legitimate interest for companies. And what has not been discussed in that, from that perspective, is that legitimate interest has specific concerns. There are specific concerns for children when children's rights are concerned. And my question would be my statement would be that innovation should never trump children's rights. And basically that's what it feels like at the moment. If you say training AI is legitimate interest, that means potentially that you can train AI on data from the classroom. And that is very diverse data in a sense. It can be basically anything that happens in the classroom or even in the school more generally. Then going on to data-driven activities, and that can be AI-related, but it's mostly also about profiling. I think children should, if children can consent to it, not all children can, you need to have a choice. So it means that you cannot just implement EdTech solutions into the classroom and say you have to use them and we're going to use your data. And this data is going to the company and we're also going to commercially exploit it. That's not a freely given choice about how your data is going to be used. So if we were to enforce this, I don't see how you can actually do this. And children can also, I think, not give informed consent to this. So it will be very problematic if we take that seriously. Also, when it goes to profiling of children, and I certainly think that profiling as part of education will have a significant impact on children, which triggers Article 22 of the GDPR, which has been interpreted in a way that actually brings in the best interest assessment. We don't have any court cases yet, but that's the way it's been interpreted by the Article 29 Working Party, endorsed by the EDPB, put forward also by the Council of Europe. If profiling is not in the best interest of children, and certainly it can be maybe in the context of education, but I'm still not sure, but if it's not in the best interest of children, you should not do it. And I like to see that enforced as well. So, and then if we're going to do it in a way that actually can sort of, that can be complying with those rules, we also have to implement privacy by design solutions. So we should only use data that is really necessary. And I think a lot of data is more, is nice to have, but is certainly not need to have. So I actually think it already provides this, the solutions to the concerns that we have. In terms of data protection, maybe not privacy more broadly, but data protection certainly. But we have to need more guidance on what those provisions mean and bring that also to the schools. And maybe one last point, because if schools do bring in EdTech, they're probably also going to be controllers. So they will have a lot of obligations. They need to do, a data protection impact assessment. I don't think schools are aware that it brings with them a lot of responsibilities to just have these systems in their schools.
Indeed, thank you very much, Simone. I think indeed that is one of the key things about GDPR, that the burden is actually shifted from the service providers to schools. But I think Hans is going to be able to tell us more about this and the challenges that schools and education authorities are facing, but also hopefully some of the best practices and the things that they are doing and gaining from the digital sphere. So Hans is head of digital citizenship at the European Schoolnet, which, you'll correct me if I'm wrong, I understand is a network at the European level of the education ministries, correct? And there, I think you have a lot of interesting exchanges and the opportunity really to see together what is working and where the gaps are. Hans is also leading on behalf of the Commission the Better Internet for Kids platform and coordinating the InSafe network of safer internet centres. So indeed, from this perspective, I think I know that there are a few questions of what's going on, what best practices and what challenges schools and education ministries and authorities are facing, what their needs are, but what are the trends, the good and the bad, maybe what standards there already are. And also, I think one question I think that'll be interesting to hear from you is about the broader ecosystem. So I think when we talk about EdTech in the classroom, there's a lot about the big tech platforms who are very heavily profiting from this business model focused on exploiting children's data. But I think, if there are any standards in place, hopefully European education authorities are looking a bit beyond that and opening up the system to a wider variety of actors. So how do you see it? What are the challenges that education authorities and schools are facing? What are maybe the benefits that they're seeing? And where do we go from here?
Okay, maybe just to start by saying that just before we start with the panel, I realized that given the fact that I represent an organization which is a network of ministries which has transforming education as part of its tagline, I probably end up being the EdTech optimist on the panel, which is something I'm not used to, also because a lot of the work we do is more about digital citizenship, children's rights. And then to make things worse, I even brought a PowerPoint. So after Sonia slashed the idea, that's just making it even worse. But the good news is that actually, I think the visual I integrated in the PowerPoint, and no AI was involved, is probably a good summary of what both Mark and Sonia were saying in terms of the kind of flawed vision on education that we often see and that we've been seeing for a long time. So this is coming from 1899 on a postcard. You mentioned film. I think in the 80s we had educational computing. There's been EdTech, there's AI. So I just want to start by saying that I personally, but also in the work we do with our ministries, we think this is a very problematic view on what EdTech or education technology should look like. It's very technocentristic. It's not very human-centric. It has a view on teaching and learning, which is about transferring information into the head of children. I think both the teacher and children don't have any agency within that context. So I just want to start by saying, when we work on education technology, that's not really what we have in mind. But we do work with EdTech providers, and we do share a lot of the concerns, but a bit like you asked in your question, I think we are trying to find ways to collaborate with them, because we do believe there are areas where we can find ways forward. I don't want to go into too much detail, but I just want to say that what I say now, I think it's also reflected in the many reports we do together with our ministries. And I have to say that most of them are EU-based, so I think there's also a bit of a discrepancy between UK, US, and then also what's happening within the European Union. At some point, you also mentioned COVID and the response to it. I have to admit, personally, I was quite happy that in my country, we've tried to keep schools open. So I think there are also, in terms of the responses we are looking for, I think there are some global differences too, and I think that's something we need to factor in too. But looking at the response to COVID, I think our view, and that's also what we heard from our ministries, is that indeed this was an example of emergency remote teaching, and I think that's the language that we try to embrace. And also after COVID, it was not about how do we keep this going, it was about what, in terms of what we've been doing, was wrong, in the sense that it did not represent what we were hoping for before. And are there certain things that we want to keep? And I think in all of these things, it is about how can you organize learning activities, how can you communicate with your pupils, how can you bring in things like student self-regulation, autonomy, student-centered pedagogies, project-based learning. So I think all of these things for us have value, and they don't correspond to the image which is out there in terms of what EdTech could promise. So again, I think there we fully agree that that's not the direction we are aiming for. And more broadly, I think also within the education space, there's a lot of discussions taking place. If you look at the COVID investments, a lot of it was also about bringing a certain type of resilience also to the education system. And part of that was about digital infrastructure, but it was also about education policy, curricular reform, professional development for teachers. So I think all of these things were on the agenda too. And within that context, increasingly so, the whole sovereignty debate in terms of what kind of alternatives can we offer compared to some of the solutions coming out of the States. I think, again, if you have the discussion with our ministries, for them, that's definitely on their mind too, and that's something that they somehow want to crack too. You referenced to some of the dynamics in the Nordics in terms of a bit of, I think, the backlash indeed, in terms of too much, and then how do we respond to that? I think for all of our ministries, so there is a clear call for education ministries to reflect on screen time, digitalization, and how to respond to that. Although I do think there as well, there's the politics and there's the policy and the policy implementation. I think probably the biggest result has been that there are no mobile phones in school any longer, at least in many places. But in terms of digitalization, I think maybe things slowed down a bit. But even in the Nordic, I think a lot of the ideas which were there, they continue as they existed before. And maybe also to say more generally, like if you talk about artificial intelligence in school education, and often a lot of that is now integrated into the EdTech solutions that we see. If you would ask our ministries what are the priorities, half of it is about the ethical concerns, and half of it is about the data privacy aspects of it. And then the other half is indeed how can we support teachers who may not be ready to use AI in the proper way in their education environment. So I think I wanted to say that when we look at these things, we broadly share the concerns. I think if you look at the policies, perhaps it's not as grim, but as with DSA enforcement, it's one thing to have the policies. The question is, how do we make that a reality in practice? So I'm the first to acknowledge that if you go to a random school in any of the countries where maybe the policy looks very good, you may be disappointed in terms of what you see in practice, because indeed that's quite a difficult thing to achieve. I think I wanted to take it also even one step further. So I don't want to defend EdTech, but we do work with EdTech, and even there I wanted just to make a bit of the differentiation between big tech EdTech and then some of the EdTech developments we see within a European context. So just to give some of the numbers which come from one of the projects we've been doing, most of the EdTech companies we end up working with, it's very small companies. Like it's not the big, amazing, heavily funded Silicon Valley kind of companies. It's small enterprises, often started by very committed teachers. So I do think it's often also linked with research and initiatives. So I do think within that sector we need to be specific in terms of what we are questioning and what we are not happy with. And I think a lot of it is about the business practices. It is about the commercial practices. And I think I would agree with all of that. But equally, if you start working on the ground, I think there are very good initiatives too. And I think there's ways to try to collaborate with them. Again, if you talk about EdTech, only a smaller part of it is actually about K-12 formal education. I think the biggest part of EdTech is more in the workplace. I think you had another event also in London where someone was talking a bit more also about venture capital kind of thing. I think they would also say we follow the states, and a lot is about the workplace. So I'm not saying that EdTech in education is fine. I'm just saying that even within that context, there is a lot of diversity, and we need to look at the kind of solutions they provide. And I would agree, if they are not fit for purpose from an education point of view, they should not be integrated to begin with. What we try to do, and I think that brings back to the ecosystem idea, and it's a bit naively simplistic, but like it's really about how do we put teaching and learning at the focus, and can we create a dynamic where indeed some of the solution providers are working with the practitioners, and that can be school leaders, it can be teachers, it can even be pupils. I think you need to bring them on board. But ideally, they themselves also work in a wider ecosystem where there is universities who are doing some of the research, where there is proper policies, data regulation practices, where there is critical NGOs who also ask the right questions. So I think if you want to move forward and if you want to find ways to embrace the opportunities, it's also about creating a system where these kind of exchanges can take place. And I know there are quite a few Dutch people in the room, and I didn't know beforehand, so I'd be very keen also to hear their views. But just to give one example, and I'm not saying that in the Netherlands all is great, because then I think Simone would probably tell me that that's not really true. But just to give the example that there are good practices in terms of what I would consider to be a bit more mature in terms of starting from a clear value framework in terms of what education should be, aiming for a situation where you indeed don't let schools, as a data controller, go through the full hassle of doing a data protection impact assessment on their own, because there are these approaches where schools collaborate together. And for example, in the Netherlands, there's a whole range of data protection impact assessments which have been done and which continue to be done, just to make sure that schools can collaborate together. And on the basis of that, certain of the procurement arrangements with some of the big companies have changed. And in addition, there's specific guidance being given to schools in terms of what they need to do in terms of how to set it up. And alongside, you need to invest and you need to support the schools and the teachers, because they do have a lot of autonomy and freedom in many countries in terms of how to approach this. So they need to understand also what their responsibilities are. So if you say, I don't think schools realize that they have a certain responsibility within that context, I think that's definitely true. But for me, the solution is to find ways to make sure that they do realize and that they feel supported in doing it. And it's not just at the school level, it's also at the teaching practice level. And I think that's the kind of dynamics that you need to aim for. So I think those are the bigger points I wanted to make. I had a final slide, which is just to say that if you think about things like digital competence framework for educators, these frameworks exist. They are being updated, upgraded. A lot of education policymakers try to embrace this. I think if you have a dynamic where you invest in schools and teachers and the competences they have, and then you also make sure you create a context where they don't need to worry about some of the high-level questions in terms of procurement, data protection, impact assessment. I think that's the model to aim for, but equally, again, it's easy to have a model or even a policy. That doesn't mean that it's all good and well in practice, but I think those are the kind of things we would need to invest in.
Thank you so much. I have a couple of maybe clarifying questions,
Okay.
if you don't mind, and if you don't know, maybe someone else. First, you said that the vast majority of the EdTech that you're seeing are actually quite small tech. But my question is, like, I think if we look at the tech ecosystem in general, of course, there's loads of small tech, but there's this huge dominance of big tech, and my understanding. And what I see, at least in practice, is that Google and Microsoft really do dominate first. So how do you make sure that there is still space and that we don't have, like we've had in other sectors, this real race to the bottom, that you don't really have it. If you're going to compete, you have to have this data-driven model. So could you explain a little bit about this bigger tech or this kind of dominance and leaving space for all of these other alternative, maybe better practices?
Yeah, so I think it's very complex, just like it is very complex with creative industries more generally. So I do think there's this question in terms of what do you want to invest in also at a European level in terms of having something that you believe in and that you feel is in line with your own public values. But at the same time, I think you're in a situation where it's very difficult not to play along with some of the big tech developments. If you look at some of the mappings we've done, I think in most countries, indeed, you will see that Microsoft, Google, they are quite important players in terms of what is being used in practice. I think, personally, you need a mixed approach. So I think if you look at countries where indeed specific terms are being negotiated with the big companies, and these kind of terms can only be negotiated with stronger partners which are active at a national level or at a regional level, I think that's a way to approach more the big tech approach. But I don't think you can say, let's kick it out entirely if you don't have any alternative, because if you look at society in general, the digital technology is there, so I would not want to go for a situation where you create schools which are completely disconnected either. So I do believe you need both. I think you need to invest bottom-up, close to home, in solutions that you believe in from an education point of view. And at the same time, you need to make sure that those things which come in the classroom, and there are some big players, that they can only be there if they comply with the rules. So that's more in terms of accountability, but also enforcement of certain existing rules.
Thank you. I think that's always the question. We can all be optimistic, and I think we all want to see good products, but are the standards, is it clear enough, and are we enforcing enough so that they do comply with the rules? I want to be able to come back to the panel, but I'm cognizant of the fact that we only have 15, a little bit more minutes left. So I'm going to take a few questions, please, not rather than comments from the room, and I'm going to collect them together. I think is somebody going to help with them? Wonderful, thank you very much. So if you wouldn't mind, please just saying very briefly who you are. I'm going to go to you first and then to you. There, please, the lady in the pink shirt, and then to you. So very briefly who you are and your question.
Hi, I'm Shura Nas. I've done many of the DPIAs you just showed on screen. Thank you. This is the whole SURF team. Well, my question is really brief. Like, we do face Google and Microsoft, and I am one of these people trying to negotiate better terms fruitlessly. So there is no negotiating with Google about YouTube. We've done a lot of good work for Workspace, but YouTube is their commercial vehicle. So my question to you is, perhaps UNESCO and European SchoolNet, why don't you start a European initiative for the education in the EU to have at least an alternative for YouTube? Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, I am Fjaka. I am a master's student at Leiden University. She is one of my professors. I was hoping to hear from this, but also from the previous workshop, something about in parallel to the benefits of AI systems and in general, like the technological tools for children, is also this huge distraction that they have and how they start learning, but somehow end up gaming or doing something completely unrelated. What's the approach on this? What can be done? Perhaps also like a regulatory approach, possibly, especially for AI systems, such as like the learning AI system like Duolingo, who in the issue that I see, for example, in those AI systems is that their engagement loops, which of course we know they are commercial because they are business, are in the gratification, the instant gratification and the streaks and everything. I'm thinking like how this can affect the discipline of a child that now is completely relying on external factors. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I'm going to still collect, I think, a couple more so that then the panelists can reply to. So I'm going to collect the two questions here, and then I'm coming back to the panel for your answers to the question and anything else you want to bring up, each for maybe 2 minutes. Okay?
Hi, thank you so much. My name is Leva. I work with the European AI and Society Fund. My question is to you, are you seeing parents organizing for really protecting their kids and data in schools? And to what Simone said about if GDPR would have been enforced, we wouldn't be in this situation. This is something that echoes across civil society over many other things as well. Where have we failed politically if that's really the case?
Thank you. And one last question, I think the lady here, the black.
Hi, I'm Emma Aldips. I'm a legal PG researcher at the KU Center for IT and IP, and I do my research in how generative AI is used by children at school. And then I had a bit of a question also in terms of GDPR, kind of linking to the previous question. I'm wondering why does the GDPR kind of seem to be neglected sometimes? I feel like the EU Commission has like this Better Internet for Kids strategy and plus and all that, and we have these references to the UNCRC and all that, but the GDPR seems like such a valuable and very quite heavy tool to use and a valuable one, but it seems to be forgotten often in debate, also in literature. So I'm wondering what could that possibly mean or why? Yeah, thank you.
Great, thank you very much. So we have, what's the European alternative in particular to YouTube? So are there initiatives? What are we going to do about the distraction? Or what do you have to say about the fact that a lot of these technologies indeed have this kind of commercial design leading to lots of other things? Are parents organizing? And why is GDPR being neglected? Poor GDPR, I agree. Okay, who wants to go first? So you've got 2 minutes each. If you can try to stick to that. Sonia, do you want to go first?
Okay, well, I have something to say about each, but not a lot, maybe. Surf, so I cite your work all the time to the British government on if the Netherlands can do something, then why can't Britain? So congratulations, I admire it. But I think it's actually a great question. So somewhere, maybe I'll link this to the point about parents organising. There is clearly enormous dissatisfaction out there from teachers, from parents, from NGOs, from children, from many. It is actually a puzzle why, in some ways, the market doesn't diversify more, and also why the many publicly funded bodies that still are surviving in Europe, why they don't step forward. And I think thinking of work that I've done with the Better Internet for Kids over the years, there was a positive content effort from the European Commission to try to kind of celebrate what was good, what could be, what good could look like. Absolutely, there were a lot of prizes. Maybe this initiative continues, but it didn't. It hasn't scaled up to the point where it's available in schools, though there are some really wonderful instances. I think parents would be delighted. I think schools would be delighted if we said, here is the, I don't know, could the EBU do it? I don't know who would. There's so much good content there. It's a matter of finding it. There's been efforts at public sector discoverability systems and so forth. Somehow the market is not doing what the market is meant to be doing, and the competition regulators are not doing what they're meant to be doing either. And then I'll just on distraction. I hear you, and I think children will say yes, they're distracted, and there's that research on if your phone is there, you can't concentrate anymore, and so on. But I would just say let's also think about the larger context of the classroom, the child's relationship with the teacher, what could be done on that technology. I went to a conference a few months ago, which was called M-Learning, which was full of people who were trying to design brilliant educational apps for the smartphone in school. And yeah, I know. But they were doing a lovely job. And they were very excited that finally kids had got, a smart bit of tech that was nicely distributed. And in many poor countries, you can't say, leave the phone at home, we'll give you a Chromebook or whatever. Thank you, Google. So it is a very significant bit of tech that we are now ruling out because we can't get a grip on its compulsive design and its commercial data practices. But the potential was there and could be again.
Thank you so much, Mark.
Yeah. On the question about parents organizing, I would say that this is a huge force, actually. We're seeing movements coming up in all sorts of different countries, and not just in Europe and North America, but all over the world, where parents are resisting sort of schools being largely screen-based experiences. And often those protestations are, my child is using screens all the time outside of school, and the school is the one place where I want my child to be developing these sort of human and social skills and engaging your sort of five senses, touch being an extremely important sense that tends to be sort of not discussed or neglected in education, but obviously does happen in schools. So movements around, there's a whole movement on schools without screens that is sort of growing in the United States, but we could look at lots of different examples. So I think there is some pushback. Hans said he was a technology optimist. I'm a technology optimist too, very much. We are not Luddites at UNESCO. We are not calling for a return of the horse and buggy and things, but what we are calling for is technology that benefits all of us. And right now what we have is technology that is benefiting a very, very small sliver of elites. And that is how the technology is designed, and it's what the logics are. I'm optimistic about technology because I think we have hit kind of peak corporate tech. And I think that there is tremendous innovation to be had with public interest technologies. Well, it may not be happening in Europe. You mentioned why are we not developing public alternatives to some of these corporate solutions? Many countries are doing exactly that. And the logics that can guide that development are so different than the logics that have to guide a for-profit corporation. It means that you can do things like you don't care about tracking somebody's data. How many of you have logins for Wikipedia? No one. How many of you feel that you're addicted to Wikipedia? How many people feel like you're spending too much time on Wikipedia? No one. Why? Because it's not built for adhesion and addiction. You can build awesome public digital learning platforms. And at UNESCO, together with our partners at UNICEF and ITU, we are putting out guidance on how to build public interest digital learning platforms. What are the principles that steer that type of solution? And look, folks, governments will often say, it's really difficult, we can't do it. But then you remind them, wait a second, you're a country of 50 million people, 100 million people. How many schools, how many teachers, how many buses? Think of the complexity of that system. And that system can't build a digital learning platform. That system can't build tools for teachers to get resources they need. Of course they can. And I think that was a generational divide, but now we are seeing in often some, different countries, you're seeing a younger generation come up and they're saying, hey, we can harness these tools and their power to build better public systems of education and ensure that this technology is in the public interest.
Thank you so much. I mean, government saying can't do it reminds me. Reflects also often tech companies saying, we can't do it. We can't know if they're children. We can't, put any safeguards in place. We can't do, someone's going to do it, aren't they? Hans, over to you. You've got 2 minutes.
Yeah, so I'm not sure if it's an answer to any of the questions, but maybe something that we've not sufficiently talked about. I don't think we're necessarily techno-optimists or pessimists, but I think we all believe that it's possible to have some kind of human-centric design which follows the right principles. And if that happens in an education environment, that's something that we would all want to put our weight behind. And I think that's also with the work we do, we believe that should be possible within a European context. So if we don't have solutions now, then I guess we should work harder to get it done. But I also appreciate there is a cost element, and I actually think the cost is perhaps also what's sometimes problematic with some of the enforcement. So if I also look from a bit closer with work we do with the Commission, the cost of putting in place an enforcement machine which can make something like the DSA a reality, it's huge. And before you know, it means that costs are taken away elsewhere, which might also benefit civil society and these kind of things. So I do think to some extent there's always this constraint of resources and priorities. And the result of it is that we sometimes have good ideas and good principles, but we end up being a bit frustrated with what it ends up being in practice. So I'm not sure that's a very optimistic way to conclude, but yeah.
Thank you so much. Well, indeed, I hope that everyone here in the room would say that investing in children and children's education should be a top priority. But yes, when it comes to practice, governments might say that and at the same time say, well, let's invest in a data center instead. Anyway, Simone, over to you.
Yeah, starting from the principles that Hans mentioned, first starting with the question about why the GDPR is neglected. I think there are several reasons. One of them is that it's a principle-based regulation, which I think is good because it's technologically neutral. We can apply it to sort of anything that processes personal data. But we have too little guidance on what it actually means that children have a high level of protection under the GDPR. Even in provisions where children are mentioned, we have too little guidance on what that actually means. So that is sorely needed. And I think also something that is needed, we have a quite good idea now in terms of data protection. What are data practices that are not in line with children's rights? And if we were ever going to review the GDPR and update it, I think we should have clearer red lines about those data practices. So it's clear, we don't have to argue, we don't need to go to court for this. Well, we probably need to, but at least it's clear what are the red lines. So those are the things. And then, of course, the enforcement is lacking because we are mostly dependent on one small data protection authority somewhere in a country in the EU. And it's maybe they can't or they won't, they don't want to. But I think we also would need to reform the enforcement system for the GDPR. And I think the DSA would be a very good example of how to do that, at least towards the very large online platforms. So I would like to see more centralized enforcement in that respect. So, and hopefully that will help then. Then the distraction, well, if you have a very boring smartphone, it's not distracting at all, it's actually, I haven't even thought about it. And basically, what is important here is that if EdTech were to be distracting in classrooms, it's just not age appropriate. Maybe it's not even human appropriate. And I've been talking about, or I've mentioned a DPIA, but I think a DPIA in the case of education would also need to factor in a children's rights impact assessment. You cannot do without that. And you mentioned the children's rights impact assessment that we made for the Netherlands. One of the things that would be my wish still is that I don't think it's really helpful for education yet. Talking about the value of education, I think we would need to add something that is actually about, looking at the educational impact, both in positive ways and in negative ways. So how do we want to impact children with EdTech in a way that actually contributes to their education, whatever that education is supposed to be, of course. So I think we would need to extend that in terms of seeing what the impact is and making sure that it actually is something that is, that we want to have in the classroom.
Thank you so much. I think on that, I'll just make two appeals. One is maybe that the digital omnibus doesn't only need to be about simplification. It could be, about actually making things work. So maybe something could be done there. Anyone in the room who's working on that, maybe take that away. The second on more guidance on the GDPR for children, I would just note that the European Data Protection Board, I think, has been working on its guidelines for children for about 5 years. So I think there's also something that could be done there. So anyway,
they can take an example from the DSA unit that came up with guidelines within a year. And
they were told they took too long, but so I think we can conclude the panel saying, although Hans is not too sure, I think we're all pretty much tech optimists, aren't we? I think we really do. What I hear is that everybody believes that there is a way to make this work. Tech is here to stay. I think any education of the of the future for the future is going to include technology. So the question is, how do we make it work? How do we get it right? And as Mark was saying, there's there's growing awareness, there's growing concerns, and we've hopefully hit peak corporate tech. I take that away. And now, if we've hit the peak, it's the time to reimagine the future and actually define what the purpose, it should be, and maybe align the purpose between, those who are putting children's best interests and have a view of what education really means, together with, the corporate or non-corporate alternatives that we maybe should be developing, so that the EdTech provided aligns with the purpose of education. So we clearly have work to do, whether it's enforcement, whether it's developing standards with child rights impact assessments and things included, going back to these basics of precautionary principle and developing public alternatives. So that's your homework, folks. I'll see you next year, and maybe you can come back, join the panel, send me a line, if you're like, we've got this great solution, and then we'll come back and assess it, and hopefully we'll be going in the right direction. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you so much.